Hey everyone, it's Emily recording again from my bedroom with an update about some of the work that we're doing around the COVID pandemic. Last Tuesday, we put out a call for healthcare workers who are interested in keeping an audio diary about their experience on the front lines of this crisis, and we were really overwhelmed to receive over 50 responses within the first 24 hours, and we continue to get people messaging us who want to participate. And I think what we're realizing is that the Nocturnist platform can continue to serve as a creative outlet for you in this time, as an expressive outlet for you in this time, as a place to come and talk about how you're feeling, what you're afraid of, what you're excited about, what you're joyful about, what you're dreading. We also just think it's really important that this unprecedented moment in medical history be documented. And what we're looking at now is really putting together an oral history of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you're interested in learning more about this and being a part of it, you can visit our website at thenocturnist.com. And if you know someone who might bring a unique perspective to this project, connect us. In the meantime, I hope everybody is staying as safe and healthy as humanly possible. I know that I'm going back to work on Thursday and definitely feeling pretty nervous about that. And it's a scary time, but we'll get through it together. And we will continue to keep you posted on everything that's going on our end of things. And we hope you'll continue to do the same. All right, that's it. Enjoy this episode.
At The Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association. It's easy to think that when it comes to medical care, there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. But drop yourself into rural Afghanistan, and all our objective ideas about medicine may not seem so objective after all. This is The Nocturnists, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. On today's episode, Rasha Khoury will take us behind the walls of a Doctors Without Borders hospital and show us what it takes to save a life. After the story, I talked to Rasha about what happens when her beliefs come into conflict with the beliefs of the people she serves.
I'm the provider with the skills to take care of this person, but ultimately the care that I provide has to be the care that they want. I can't force them in any way.
Here's Rasha.
When I remember this morning in Afghanistan, I remember it in my body. I remember the blast of cold as I rolled out from under my pile of blankets on my mattress on the floor into the shipping container that was my sleeping quarters. My phone was ringing. It was my Nokia flip phone, which is my on-call phone, how my team in the delivery room could reach me. And the midwife said, "Doctor, come, patient not well," and hung up immediately. This was code for a catastrophic event on labor and delivery. And I threw on my hijab, and I was in my long dress scrubs, which are very similar to this, but with longer sleeves. And I ran the 4 minutes it takes to get to our delivery room. As I ran, I was breathless from the 4-minute run in the cold, and I could hear the call to prayer, which always has a very calming effect on me because it reminds me of home. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, and I work for Doctors Without Borders. I was working in our project in Afghanistan in an area called Khost, which is a very rural part of Afghanistan. And it's our biggest obstetric project in the world. We deliver 24,000 women and babies a year, which is staggering when you compare it to places I've worked in both the US and the Middle East. I'm from the Middle East, and I grew up in an area actually where MSF, Doctors Without Borders, works and has worked since the 80s. And I was obsessed as a kid with their cars and their no weapons logos, because otherwise I grew up in a very militarized area with a lot of gunned people all around. I always wanted to be an activist, and I thought that my path to that was to be a doctor activist. And I've been working for Doctors Without Borders for 6 years now. Back in Afghanistan, I rushed through the delivery room door and was met with a wall of heat, the smell of blood, placentas, birth, sweat. My team was absolutely exhausted looking. Midwives were running everywhere. My Afghan doctor colleague was helping a woman who was having a postpartum hemorrhage, which is excessive bleeding after delivery. Women were in every bed separated by plastic curtains. Most of them were praying. Some had just delivered a baby that was on their chest, and some were waiting for a baby that seemed to never want to come out. I quickly asked the midwife who the patient was that needed my attention, and she pointed to a lifeless-looking woman on the floor of the delivery room. And this woman was laying in a pool of blood with her burqa by her side and her hijab also soaked in blood. And her head was in the lap of her female caretaker who was rocking back and forth and crying. I approached her quickly to check and make sure she had a pulse, and all I could think was she looked exactly like the women who arrived at our gate, who often arrived dead, and all I could do was give my condolences to the family and turn them away. And I desperately, with everything in me, wanted her to not be one of those women, to not be one of our mortality statistics. I could feel a pulse. I called the operating room team, which is my midwife colleagues, a nurse anesthetist. We put her on a stretcher and pushed her into the operating room. I'm cutting off her clothes with scissors, and I'm using these pliers that we have to take off all their jewelry, which are often like tens of bracelets made of metal and plastic. My anesthetist is putting in IV lines and intubating her. And in this project, as in most of our projects, we don't have a ventilator. So intubating her means that somebody is actually standing by her bedside and manually pumping a bag in order to give her oxygen. I'm racking my brain for what could possibly be going on. And I start to examine her. I examine the vagina, I examine the cervix, and then I feel a tear that's in the cervix. And the tear goes all the way up into the uterus. And I can feel my heart racing as I understand that what's happened is that she's essentially hemorrhaging into her abdomen. I'm scrubbing my hands, I'm scrubbing her belly. I open her belly and I find about 2 liters of blood. I look up at the screen and her heart is racing and her blood pressure is barely recording on the machine. I start to work and know that what I need to do is a hysterectomy, which is removing the uterus in order to stop the bleeding. And women at childbirth can bleed around 500 cc's every minute, and so they can essentially exsanguinate in a blink of an eye. We remove the uterus, and I look up, and they're giving her a bunch of whole blood, and I realize that her heart rate's slowing down a little bit, her blood pressure seems to be a little bit better, and I take a deep breath, and I think, okay, uterus is out, source of bleeding's out, maybe we're going to be okay. Maybe we're in the clear. And as I think that, I sort of stare at my feet, and I realize that I'm drenched in sweat because we're wearing these plastic aprons to protect us under these cloth scrub materials that are meant to keep us and the patient in a sterile way. And I look at the floor, and there's blood on the floor, and the blood is watery. And I look back in her pelvis, and I realize that every single thing that we've touched, every pedicle that we've taken is bleeding. I take sponges and I hold pressure, one sponge, I hold for a minute, take it off, and there's blood again. I take another sponge, and again, and again, and again, and the blood just keeps welling up. And I realize that, to my absolute horror, she's in something called DIC, which is disseminated intravascular coagulation, and essentially the body's exhaustion with its attempts to stop hemorrhage, and so it consumes all of its platelets, all of its coagulation factors, and essentially people can die very quickly. I'm not sure what to do, and so I throw a bunch of sponges in the abdomen and laps and packs in order to hold pressure and cause tamponade as my anesthetist is pumping more and more whole blood into her. And this is the most unique and spectacular project, and everyone here who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with it and think about it every day. But one of the unique things is that we have a blood bank where we can actually collect blood from people. And we have whole blood, which is this miraculous, special kind of blood that has every single component in it that can help somebody recover from something like DIC. And blood donation culture in Afghanistan is incredible. People come from everywhere to give blood to anyone. So men were streaming in from the nearby mosque to give us units of fresh blood, which is just magical and life-saving. I realized that I just need to close her abdomen and we need to keep giving her more blood. And I throw on a white coat on top of my sweaty scrubs to run out to talk to her family and explain what has happened. And to talk to her family, I have to go out into the male caretaker area, which is an area shrouded by curtains to maintain gender segregation in our project. And I meet with her husband and her brother-in-law, and I explain that she's in a very critical state, and this is what we've done so far, but we need more time. And to my disappointment and horror, they look at me and they say, we need to put her in a car right now, and we need to take her to Kabul. And Kabul is the capital of Afghanistan and is about 4 to 5 hours drive away from our project. And I think there are 10 different ways that she can die on that road between here and Kabul, and that is the absolute last thing that needs to happen right now. I plead with them to let her stay, and they, I think because of the insistence of my pleading and my attempts at speaking in Pashto, acquiesce and say they'll give me some hours. I run back in to meet her in the recovery room, and I realize that we do have a blood pressure, and the heart rate seems to be slowing down a little bit. She stays in our recovery room for 24 hours, and the next day I'm actually able to take her back to the operating room and remove those packs that I'd put in her, and I see there's no bleeding. At this point, we've given her around 13 units of whole blood, which is a dramatic amount. I close her up, and eventually, 12 hours later, she's able to go to our recovery ward, which is our IPD, where women recover after complicated surgery. On the first day, she starts to make some urine, which is the most beautiful thing to see after somebody has been in hemorrhagic shock. On the third day, she develops a fever, and I think to myself, could I have caused her to have an infection because of those packs that I put in her belly? On the fifth day, she develops abdominal distension, and she's not moving her bowels, and I think, oh my God, I must have nicked some loop of bowel, and she has an obstruction. On the seventh day, she finally starts to move around in the ward. She passes gas. She's able to drink some of the soup I made her. I made her ramen soup, which she'd never had in her life. And my team made fun of me forever. She loved it. By the 10th day, she's walking in the garden, and she's smiling. And she's asking me when she can go home back to her baby. And saying goodbye to patients in MSF projects is impossible because I think of all the ways that they could die once I let them go, and I just want to hang on to them forever. In Afghanistan, I don't know if someone's going to die from a complication in the postpartum period, if they're going to die from a war-related reason, if they're going to die from a roadside accident, from gender-based violence, from another illness, from lack of water or food. Eventually, I acquiesced because I realized it's more important for her to be with her babies than to be with us. And on the last day with us, she lets me take a photograph of her that I still have and cherish. And she's sitting with her mother-in-law on a bench in the garden in a beautiful red hijab, and she's smiling. She goes home, and I leave Afghanistan, and I actually go to Iraq, to a different project that's a pretty intense war. And I'm immersed in other people's life stories, and I quickly forget about her. About a year ago from today, actually, I was back in Afghanistan for 7 months, where I was the medical director of this project. So I was there in a different role. I was working with families to liaise referrals to Kabul. I was helping settle disputes. I was organizing care. I was helping the blood bank organize for more blood. And I was in the caretaker area talking with a family about the delivery of their female relative when a man saw me from far away, and he waved at me, and he looked so familiar, but I couldn't place him at all. He came up to me, and he was like, "Doctor, do you remember your patient Mariam?" And I thought to myself, absolutely not. I have no idea what he's talking about. I've taken care of hundreds of Mariams since, and I just couldn't remember. And then he started to tell her birth story. And her birth story is unforgettable. I think about it every time I have a patient with a postpartum hemorrhage, and I feel it viscerally in my body. And what he was saying, I couldn't believe, which is that she was inside. She was the female relative for his wife who was having a baby. And I ran inside to find her. And when I walked into the room, she recognized me instantly and came over and gave me this huge embrace. And I think my heart just about exploded. It was the highlight of my professional career. I couldn't believe that she was actually standing in front of me, not just alive, but looking super well, having thrived in the time that I'd seen her. You learn so much about yourself when you work with MSF. You're absolutely outside of your comfort zone. You're working with people who are living the most precarious lives. And Miriam taught me a lot about vulnerability, but also about resilience. And I carry that with me every day, and I think about that project every day.
So I am sitting here with Rasha Khoury. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that well, but
That's great.
it's really nice to be with you.
Thank you for having me.
So could you tell us a little bit about where you were born and just growing up, really brief?
Yeah, so I'm a Palestinian woman. I was born in East Jerusalem in the 80s and grew up there for about 20 years before I moved to the U.S. for medical training and school, and eventually to work with Doctors Without Borders. But I actually grew up in an area where Doctors Without Borders served the community, and so I was constantly, as a kid, obsessed with their cars, which if you haven't seen them, they're usually like Land Cruisers with big no weapons stickers on them. And this idea of, a team of people that was working in sort of a nonviolent way and absolutely unarmed in a city and place that was pretty heavily armed and heavily militarized was one of the first things that attracted me to them. And then I decided that they were the kinds of activists that I wanted to be. And so I ended up becoming actually a doctor in order to work with them.
And it sounds like you gravitated toward OBGYN, reproductive health, women's health. I'm wondering what was driving you in that direction. And then also as a young, precocious, smart woman growing up in Jerusalem, how your family and your community reacted to your interest in this specific, very specific, like women's reproductive care, how that panned out.
Yeah, so I was raised in a deeply matriarchal and feminist family, which is also pretty unique in the area where I grew up. My father was a political prisoner for many years of my childhood, and so was not around. He remained sort of this presence, but the people really like taking care of me and guiding me were my mom and my grandmother, paternal grandmother. And both of them are sort of fiercely independent women who led their own paths in their lives. And really just the entire space that I lived and existed in was such a female space and such a feminist space. My mom and both my parents are human rights journalists. And so during this time, my mom was working full time and working in this sort of witnessing of human rights atrocities and writing about them and being on the radio and giving interviews about them. And that was really influential into how I thought about people's rights.
Such a unique upbringing, really interesting. Were your parents born and raised in that region as well?
So my father is born and raised in Palestine. My mom actually is Italian-American and moved to the Middle East in the early 70s. She studied political science in Beirut and then became a journalist and was a correspondent in Jerusalem. And she actually has lived now for about 4 decades in Jerusalem. So we joke in my family that she's more Arab than most of us.
I'd love for you to now take us into the field with you a little bit. So I'm sure a lot of the doctors listening and also people who don't work in healthcare are wondering, like, what is it like to be a doctor specifically for Doctors Without Borders? Like, can you take us a day in the life of a doctor who's in the field working? I'm sure it's different in different regions, but maybe just like a blueprint of what it looks like.
Yeah. So a day in the life might be that you're waking up in a compound where you're sharing, a room with one person or multiple people. That person might be, the architect, or it might be the security focal point, or it might be the midwife. And you're sharing breakfast, you're sharing bathroom, you're, you might be taking a shower with a bucket, and the water might be cold. In Sierra Leone, it was chlorinated, so we could get rid of Ebola or Lassa fever transmission. What types of things you're eating absolutely change depending on the context. It could be anything, extravagant, like eggs and bread, or it could be like a granola bar or a spoonful of Nutella. And then depending on where you are, you might be living in the hospital that you're working in. And you might have to travel by these land cruisers, across muddy roads to get to the area where our hospital exists. And when I say hospital, it can be a series of multiple tents. It could be sort of a structure that's like a big shipping container. It could be barricaded with sandbags. It could be absolutely lush and green and beautiful garden where you can like just walk over. So you learn to also adapt to like these different settings. And the hospitals themselves are often incredibly busy, especially as I work in maternity. So often the volume is nothing like you've seen ever before. So in places like Afghanistan, we were taking care of 90 to 100 women every 24 hours. So if you think about comparing that, for example, to a place in New York or San Francisco where we might be delivering 2,000 women a year or 2,500 a year, in Afghanistan we were delivering something like 2,000 a month. And so you learn quickly how to triage, how to work in a pretty big group, how to delegate for sure, and really how to spot like who needs your care the most urgently. And I'd say you're also dealing with people who are living in the community that you're serving. So often you're taking care of staff that are having the same stresses and pressures that patients are having. And so in Afghanistan as well as Iraq, I worked with many female staff who were victims of gender-based violence or people who were crossing the same insecurity on the roads or war-like conditions to come to work. And there's a trauma that's there because of that, and it's often chronic, and it's not something that people are just experiencing one time, but it really affects how people can hear you or listen to you and what they're able to focus on and what's priority for them. And so that's really, it's critical to sort of work through that with compassion. The context of people's lives come into their work, and if you can't see that, you really you kind of lose your team.
One thing that I find really interesting about your work is here you are, the daughter of a human rights journalist, feminist, doing this human rights, feminist, medical work, reproductive health. But it's in these places where, as you said, gender-based aggression, gender-based violence is really common, and there's a lot of things set up in the culture. For example, one thing you said is sometimes before a hysterectomy, the husband or brother needed to give permission, things like this. So I'm wondering, for you, how do you make sense of those competing ideologies and like work compassionately at the intersection of those things? Because I imagine that would be really like sort of ethically exhausting.
Yeah, so it's interesting because one thing I didn't mention that I learned in the field with MSF is our idea about informed consent in sort of Eurocentric or American-centric settings is really individual. Like, I give you the risks and benefits, you give me your informed consent, or you don't. And really consent outside of here is, and I'm sure in many places I haven't been to, is pretty communal. So certainly in Palestine it's the case, but also in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was very much the family deciding together what could happen or would happen, depending on the risks and benefits that were explained. And so it wasn't always a male figure, but often a male figure was involved. Certainly, probably my first mission, it was very jarring to have to go to a man and say, your wife is going to die unless we do a hysterectomy or unless we get blood. Will you give us blood, or can we do the hysterectomy? And in West African contexts where I've been, often the answer was no, and I would lose women because of that. And that was, yes, absolutely devastating to sort of wrap my head around and really try to understand. As I've worked more and in different contexts, I've seen how often people are weighing things that I don't understand about the family dynamic, about other children, other wives, who's taking care of who, what kind of stresses they're dealing with, whether it's related to war or famine or climate, drought. And that realization that there were so many more factors than I could comprehend and or relate to have made it easier over the years. Not to say that it's normalized sort of misogyny. I hope that doesn't sound that way. But in Afghanistan, what I learned is that women were always prioritized over fetuses, for example. And for me, as a provider who believed deeply in, saving a woman's life always takes priority, it sort of gelled with my frame of values or mind. But I definitely saw colleagues coming from, Mexico, Brazil, Portugal, China, where this idea that we would not save the fetus and save the woman instead was really traumatizing for them and really hard for them to participate in. And so I only say this to say that the things that sort of met with my values, I was like kind of okay with, and the things that really clashed took time to comprehend. But to illustrate that, in Afghanistan, many women refuse cesarean section for fetal reasons. But the first few times that a woman refused a C-section because, the cord was prolapsed, so the cord was like falling down, but the baby was still inside, and that eventually leads to a fetal death. And a woman said to me, I can't have a C-section. I have 10 kids at home. I need to have more babies after this one. If you think there's a chance that this one's going to be compromised, I just want to have a vaginal delivery. And sometimes that meant delivering a dead baby. And sometimes that actually meant delivering a live baby that was fine. But it's just that we don't let that sort of natural experiment proceed in other contexts that I work. I'm the provider with the skills to take care of this person, but ultimately the care that I provide has to be the care that they want. And if it's not the care that they want, then I can't force them in any way.
Can you remember a time where you felt especially conflicted about perhaps your values or ideas coming up against that of a culture or a community or a family or an individual that you were taking care of?
I noticed, this is a reflection on me, but I noticed that in the areas where I understand the, ethno-religious context or have some language ability, for example, Afghanistan, it was much easier for me to communicate and accept whatever the family offered. And in places where my language ability or my cultural understanding didn't meet the community, for example, in Sierra Leone, where I was in a maternity project in the middle of an Ebola epidemic. And there I found it incredibly challenging to understand. And I do remember a case where a woman came in hemorrhaging and pretty much in hemorrhagic shock after having bled a great deal at home. And it was before we understood that there was Ebola around us in the vicinity, and before we sort of knew to be alarmed. And really appropriately triage and take care of that kind of patient. But I informed her family that she needed a hysterectomy. They approved it, but they said that they couldn't give any blood. And at the time, I took it to be like a sort of unvaluing of this woman's life. Like they just didn't want to give the blood. They didn't think she was worth it. She died. And it took about a week for me to understand, as we saw more and more cases of Ebola come to us, that what was happening was absolute fear in the community. Midwives explained to me that there's also a cultural understanding in Sierra Leone that giving blood is a sort of giving of the soul, and that it's very difficult to find somebody who would be willing to do that. It was really, for a week, completely agonizing because I felt like it was this death that almost in any other MSF context, we probably could have prevented.
I really I'm glad that you shared that story about the woman in Sierra Leone, because I feel like it's an important contrast with the story that you chose to share with us, which is the story of Miriam.
Yeah.
And Miriam's story has a happy ending. And what I'm hearing you say is that a lot of these outcomes have to do with context. And some of this context is so big that we just, especially us over here in the States, just can't really grasp it. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this community in Afghanistan and why that was so unique. Like why her life hinged so much on that generosity. And do you think that the community is aware that their gift of blood is saving lives? Or maybe just talk a little bit about you talk about how this is a really special case for you. And so what was so special about it?
Yeah. So first of all, I have to say this project in Afghanistan is incredibly special. So it's in an area called Khost, which is a very rural area in the eastern province. And it's on the border with Pakistan, which is a pretty porous and insecure border. It's a ethnically Pashtun area, and it's pretty heavily ruled by the Taliban, and pretty underserved by the government of Afghanistan. That said, people in this area are also dealing a great deal with not just the effects of war, but also climate change, actually increasingly in the last few years with terrible droughts. And this is a pretty agricultural area, so the aridness of the land and the inability to plant and the inability to access water really impacts people's lives. But what's incredible, it's the largest emergency obstetric project in all of MSF. And it's really grown over the years in terms of community acceptance of MSF being in this area, and willingness to bring women to the facility for care. There's very much certainly insecurity on the roads, and so people are pretty afraid of traveling for good reason, but also the roads are not always passable, and people need money to access transportation of some form. And so there are multiple layers of challenge to getting somebody from their home to the hospital. On top of that, we recently, a few years ago, did a anthropological sort of assessment of the community and asking questions about what are the barriers to bringing women to receive obstetric care. And one of the main barriers was the sort of taboo-ness of talking about bleeding or, pain, labor pain or pelvic pain, and that women needed the male escort to bring them, whether that was a brother or a husband. And that was a huge sort of first barrier in terms of seeking care. And we were right next to a mosque, which is hugely beneficial for sort of galvanizing support. Anytime we needed blood, we would make a call in the mosque. And I would say every time at least 5 to 10 men would come to the gate and say that they were willing to donate. I thought that it was only to do with saving women's lives, with this sort of idea that women were the people birthing the nation and sort of the people helping, maintain the population of Afghan boys and men. But I learned from my staff that in times of, war crisis, hundreds of people would flock to the government hospital, to give blood to the war wounded. And so it was just a culture of aid and solidarity in the way that they could. And so I think that's what makes that place extra unique.
Sounds like a really amazing project and place. There is one more question that I had about MSF. You mentioned in this particular area, there's a lot of insecurity. The roads may not be safe. The border is porous between the two countries. And you hear sometimes about MSF hospitals being threatened or even, attacked or bombed. So I was wondering, how do you think about that risk, and your team, how do they think about that risk? Have you ever been stationed somewhere that's particularly vulnerable? And can you take any precautions to protect yourself?
Yeah, so certainly MSF is increasingly working in more and more precarious contexts, just because I think the context of humanitarian aid and war across the world has become more and more insecure. Certainly many of our projects in Yemen and previously in Afghanistan have been bombed. I don't know if your listeners know, but the largest bombing of a hospital of MSF in Afghanistan was actually by the U.S. Army. And so it's hard to always know where the threat is going to come from. MSF takes security for its staff and its patients super, super seriously. And many actually of the international staff think that sometimes the rules are too rigorous. But what we really count on is community acceptance and community protection, because we're unarmed in all of these places. And in this particular area in Afghanistan, we've sort of built a community goodwill over the years. And our medical care is really our insurance. So the better the care, the more people are happy to have us and protect us. So I have felt very, very safe in all the contexts that I've worked. I would say the most precarious has been Iraq. I worked in Mosul around the time of the ISIS, sort of the end of the ISIS siege of the city and the recapturing by the government. And that was a pretty scary time to be there. And I think what was frightening about it was, you think of war and you think of like loud bombs and shooting, and people don't think about chemical weapons or kidnapping. And I think those are, for me personally, the things that frighten me a little bit more. And sort of coming to terms with your own fear and being able to say also, like, where do you draw the line for yourself? Because where I draw the line for me is different than my colleague. And in MSF, we always see, like, which is unfortunately a privilege of having an international status, but I think I'm going to go home. I'm not going to stay in this context. And we talk a lot about how the injustice of that, I can say that, but my Afghan colleague or my Iraqi colleague whose home is where they're working can't say that, even if maybe they have similar feelings. And so there's a lot of ethical balancing and a little bit of ambiguity, I think, in how you feel about different contexts at different times.
Wow. Well, thank you for your amazing work.
Thank you.
And for coming in to speak with me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to The Nocturnists. Have you ever navigated different cultures as you've taken care of patients? We'd love to hear about it. Leave us a message at 415-991-0958, and your voice may be featured on a future episode. If you like what you hear, consider visiting our website and making a gift. It really helps us keep going. If you'd like to come on as a sponsor, or if you're interested in having our team produce a live show in your town, please get in touch. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, an organization that's done so much great work with medical student loan forgiveness, supporting primary care residency programs, and really keeping the doctor-patient relationship at the center of medicine. You can learn more about them in the show notes. The Nocturnist is made possible by Well Physician California, which aims to be the most comprehensive program in the country to increase physician wellness. You can learn more about them in the show notes. I want to thank our executive producer, Ali Block, our head of story development, Adelaide Papazolo, our podcast producer, Liza Veal, and our communications director, Chloe Lassard. Our original artwork is by Lindsay Mound, our original theme song is by Yosef Monroe, and all other music is from Blue Dot Sessions. Please subscribe, rate, and review our show on Apple Podcasts. It actually helps. And of course, spread the word to your friends, family, and colleagues. Until next week, we are the Nocturnists.